We have agency, we have power.
Yeah.
Easy to feel like you're floating along in space aimless, but we can ground ourselves in these things. And I think what makes it especially hard in American culture is that we are such an individualistic culture. Community isn't necessarily built in. It is in pockets here and there, but by and large, as a society, we are very individualistic. So when we go through these things where we're experiencing a loss and grieving, it can be that much harder to find community. So I would tell people, you start to build that community now, before a loss happens or something, just because it's mentally healthy for you as well. It's mentally and emotionally healthy. But whether you're experiencing grief or not, always try to build a sense of community around yourself.
Hello, my grieving friends. It's your host, Lisa Keefauver here. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Now, just in case you're new to the show, yes, this is a podcast all about grief. We explore the expansiveness and the pervasiveness of grief in our lives because, let's face it, 100% of us will experience grief multiple times in our lives. What I've learned over my 20 plus years as a social worker and the more than a decade I've spent now as a widow is that if we lean in, hold space, bear witness for one another in the most profoundly difficult seasons of our lives, that's where true connection, healing, community building happens. Today, I'm joined by Olivia Abousaid. Born and raised in Dallas to Palestinian parents, her journey has instilled in her a deep appreciation for personal growth and navigating cultural nuances. Now residing in LA, Olivia brings her expertise as a master certified coach to empower individuals to unlock their full potential, navigate their unique journeys through grief, whether it's the loss of a loved one, coping with chronic illness, or grappling with unfulfilled dreams. Our conversation traverses a wide landscape of types of losses and facets of grief, from the death of loved ones, witnessing and experiencing racism and genocide, dreams deferred and denied, and the grief over the limitations brought on by living with lupus, a chronic illness. We don't experience grief in a vacuum, you know that, and as I talk and write about in my work, we must understand the cultural context of our losses and how the pervasive and often misguided narratives of grief can contribute to our unnecessary suffering. Olivia knows the importance of this too, which is why we also explored the nature of grief in the context of generational trauma and cultural influences. Olivia emphasized the role of community and agency in navigating ongoing grief, as well as our need to sit with the complexities of emotions that arise. Like me, Olivia recognizes that finding joy and delight amidst sorrow, though difficult, is a necessary tool for healing. And boy, do we need that reminder now more than ever. Olivia sees this and other tools as important to our self-care. She reminds us that along with rest, these are necessary in sustaining activism and personal well-being. This was a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure by the end of the episode, you will agree. Hello, Olivia Abousaid. Thank you so much for joining me on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yes. Well, listeners heard a little bit more about your story, about your family story, about the work that you're doing in grief and coaching and transformation at the top of the show. And we're going to dive into that. And today, listeners, by the way, we're going to talk about quite a wide expanse of the sources of our grief, from things like trauma and genocide to the dreams deferred to the chronic illnesses that create losses in our lives. So we're going to travel quite a journey today. I just wanted to name that at the top of the show. And today, starting as I do with all of my podcast guests, I want to ground us or orient us into where we learned the grief beliefs that we hold, each of us do, of course, from a broader cultural context, but also for us, it often happens in the ways in which the adults in our lives model grief when we face some early loss or when the family faces an early loss. And I'm just wondering if you might take yourself back to an early loss you experienced and what you were taught or shown implicitly or implicitly about what it means to navigate grief. Is there a story that comes to mind or?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're born Palestinian, you're kind of born into grief and you're born with this generational trauma that's passed down. I'm the third generation now to experience that trauma with loss of land and everything that comes with. But the first memories I think I have of what I recognized as grief for the first time as a child were when my parents started to lose their parents. My parents immigrated here in the 70s, and then they had me and my siblings. So we're first generation. We're the first in our families to be born here in the States. And one by one, they started to lose their parents to heart attacks and strokes. So it was very sudden and unexpected. That all happened when we were very young, and I didn't quite understand what was happening, but I understood it was bad and that they lost parents. And I remember when my father got the news that his mother had died, he started crying, and it was the first time in my life I had seen him cry. And I had what, now you can look back and say was not the greatest response. I started laughing to his crying because I had never seen him cry before. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what the sound was that was coming out of him. I thought he was joking or it was a different kind of laugh. So I started laughing, only to realize this was grief, that he had lost his mother. And so I think growing up and seeing that, it did inform how I dealt with grief because, there was maybe the one emotional outburst. And then after that, it was kept quiet. I think they were trying to protect us kids from the grief and just move along with life. But I think it did inform me to an extent in that grief is a quieter process that you kind of keep to yourself and you just keep moving on. And I don't think we totally understand that process is happening when we're kids, but it does get in there. It soaks in, and that's how we deal with grief going on. We don't realize that there are other ways to deal with grief.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing a little bit of that story. And of course, there's the context of the different kinds of losses your family had already faced, and also maybe, that this loss happened far away. But to your point, this is why I have these conversations with clients. So when I teach, at universities, everywhere I go, is that it's not about, railing against our parents for quote unquote not doing a good job teaching us. It's just the power of how even implicit or at the absence of behaviors or conversations can teach us things, or we can be teaching people things even when we're not bringing our intention there. So these questions over the last 6 seasons have really just been part of my mission to reimagine grief. And part of that requires us to bring awareness to the beliefs that we hold, and then how our own behaviors might be teaching other people things about grief that maybe if we knew that's what we were teaching, we wouldn't. I hear that answer so often. I even experienced that as a widow with a 7-year-old, was this, I want to protect my kids. And of course, we're not showing our kids, age inappropriate things or talking about things. And yet, as you experienced, when we quote unquote protect our kids, what we're also protecting them from is a role model of what it means to navigate the very messy, scary, difficult journey of grief, and that it can look like wailing tears that maybe might make your kid laugh because they're uncomfortable and don't know, or it might look like rage, or it might look like, all kinds of anxiety and all kinds of things. Yeah.
I'm sure that can be a very thin line to walk when you're a
Yeah.
parent. So it's hard to hold that against your parents.
Yes, exactly. And also our parents were once kids who witnessed the implicit and explicit ways in which their family modeled grief or not. And so right? I think about that all
Mm.
the time, is like, especially once you become a parent, you realize like, we're just all making it up and we're just drawing on the resources that the few resources have. So that was an early experience of grief. And as you said, your father in particular, but maybe your family in general, just kind of got to which many people can relate to in their family systems, kind of, we don't need to talk about it. We're just going to get back to work. We're going to, get busy building our lives. Was that true too? Not just about the sort of profound loss that you faced with the grandparents passing, but also all of the losses, as you alluded to. Your family, had lost land in generations over time in Palestine. And was that also a loss and a set of experience of grief that also wasn't talked about? Or how did that differentiate versus kind of death loss in your family?
Yeah, for sure. It was, my parents always tried to instill in us our heritage and our ethnicity and to have pride in being Palestinian and to teach us about our history and culture. But I don't think grief was addressed as much in that. I think it was more implicit. It was, these things have happened, these things are happening. And, hopefully things will change in the future and get better for Palestine and Palestinians. But grief was not addressed directly. And I'm not sure if they even recognized it themselves. I'm not sure that they really recognized it as grief. I think now I've been having a lot of conversations with my mother. My father died in 2001, unfortunately, but I've been having a lot of conversations with my mother about what's going on in grief. And I think maybe she is recognizing more now that that is what this is. That what we're experiencing. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of depression and sadness and anxiety and all of it. But back then, we didn't really talk about that. And so as an adult, with the racism that I experienced and then continuing to watch these horrific things going on in the Middle East, I didn't have the language for it, nor did I recognize it as grief. It was only in these past few years that I've begun to do the work and recognize, hey, all of this that I've experienced, it's mired in a lot of grief. There's a lot of loss.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to just be a person just says thank you for bringing that story here into our conversation. And so I want to be mindful of how I navigate that. But one of the things you brought up, I think is important, which is your mother and maybe your father, although we can't speak for them, but your mother is sort of saying to you now that you're having these conversations. Now, when I look back, I can see that it's all intermixed with a lot of loss, but that wasn't something that she felt able of identifying, let alone sort of metabolizing or processing. And so I wonder then, and we know, and I think probably from your work, right? There's intergenerational trauma and there's intergenerational grief. If we don't metabolize our grief, we will pass it down to that next generation. And so I wonder how you might be thinking right now of the sort of delayed grief, maybe that your mom is beginning to process, and how much of that have you carried, or are you recognizing you've carried? So as you are starting to attend to your own grief now, like some of it's yours, but maybe also some of it's for all the people in your family who didn't get to. Does that seem too out there?
No, you're right on the right track with that. Yeah, for sure. I watched my parents growing up, and in conversations with my mom now, they're very angry people. And my mom is very angry right now, and I'm finding I'm very angry right now. We're bearing witness to genocide, and without getting into it too much, our government tax dollars are going to contribute to that. And so there's it's horrific to watch that and to know that and to feel the guilt of that. Obviously, with grief, I think we both know that there's guilt in there. It's one of the many emotions and things. Anger that you have to deal with the grief. And so I didn't totally understand why they were so angry growing up. And now I'm experiencing it in myself. I'm like, why am I so angry all the time? And I think because we didn't know it was grief, we didn't process it as grief. There is a certain helplessness in watching
Yes.
this happen in a generational manner over all of these years. We just didn't have the language for it, didn't have the words to express it. And so I'm working through that anger now through the work that, you know, through the coaching work that I do. I'm also working on it with some of my clients, but it's prevalent. It's there, and I see it in my mom to this day. And we have some really great conversations about where that anger comes from and how to deal with the anger and things like that. But it's one of those things you can't help, but you kind of learn. You have to learn to recognize it and use some healthy coping mechanisms.
Yes. Anger, like all emotions, don't have inherent value. They're not good or bad. They're actually a sign of something that needs to be recognized and moved. And to your point, what happens for many of us when we don't feel permission or don't feel safety, which I can imagine, like emotional safety, it's not necessarily physical safety, although that happens too. But when we don't feel emotional safety to process any of our emotions, it gets locked in a way that can become really harmful and then can come out sideways. As you said, now I think about my parents as being angry people. And at the time, maybe you were like, why are you angry about X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
Whereas really there was this deep-seated anger, which so many of us have experienced, by the way, whether or not we've survived something like a genocide, although I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, so I know who didn't necessarily deal with the emotions, and generations deal with the emotions of the time. So when you think about for yourself, for your clients, if you're somebody who's coming to recognize maybe your own current grief, but that also you're carrying grief, which might look like anger, which might look like hypervigilance, which might look like deep sadness or depression or whatever, and maybe you're recognizing that you're carrying some grief from a generation or two before you, what are you finding is like, how does somebody step into that? What's a way in? What's a safe container to begin to sort of unpack this layered level of grief, especially as it is experienced in this way? What have you learned or noticed?
It is so multi-layered. It really is. It's multi-layered and it's all happening at once. It's all, it's
a multiverse that's happening and compounding. And
exactly. It can be quite a lot to deal with. I think the first step, like with so many healing processes, is first recognizing that it's happening.
Yes.
And for so long, I didn't. It really became apparent to me, my own grief over what's going on. When Black Lives Matter first started happening a few years ago, and, all these discussions were happening around racism.
Yes.
And it really brought up a lot for me and a lot of the racism that I've experienced. I was 13 during the first Gulf War, and I had kids coming up to me at school saying some very racist and denigrating things. We were getting death threats at our house, just over the years experiencing all these different forms of racism and prejudice. And to this day, watching people who don't care that a genocide is happening, it's, where to begin talking about that.
Yeah.
But I think the first part is recognizing, and during the Black Lives Matter movement, when all these things were coming up for me about the racism that I've experienced, a good friend asked me, how have you grieved over the racism you've experienced? And it was a mind-blowing question to me.
The power of a question, by the way. Here's to the power of a question, right?
Right. Like, I had never thought about it. I had never thought about grieving over it. And it opened so much for me. And it's a question that has stayed with me for years now. And it did bring me to this work, to the grief and transformation work that I do now. I had started out just wanting to do transformation, and then grief kept coming up. That question kept coming up.
Can I just pause you and invite you to think back to that version of you when that friend asked you that question? What did you feel in your body? What thought did you have? Like, so if somebody's listening and they just had an aha when they heard you ask that question, can you recall what could, like, because you didn't even have language before somebody asked you that question for it. So what did you make of that at that time? What was that experience like?
I stopped. It stopped me in my tracks. It was a shocking question. I really had to stop and take some time with it. And I just said, I haven't, I've just kept going, I didn't realize there was an alternative.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and
I
the other,
really,
no, well, the alternative, and I guess my question back would be, one of the things that I think grieving needs is a safe container.
Mhm.
And when you're still being under threat from ongoing racism, how do you then, different than a death loss, and I'm not rank ordering grief, by the way,
Sure.
all grief is valid and has its space. But for instance, when you experience a death loss, it's an event that happens and you will be grieving for the rest of your life, but you aren't necessarily, depending on the kind of death loss, at risk, literally, or, like aren't other harms coming at you. But to grieve something that's ongoing, which is kind of an ambiguous grief, right? That's a whole different category. No? Yeah.
It's a challenge, and it's a challenge that I face with my clients in my practice because I will say, I don't think we ever get over grief. We find ways to cope and we find ways to move on and in healthy ways, but when it's an ongoing grief, it's more complicated.
Yes.
And there is that term complicated grief
Yes.
to describe that. And it's a disenfranchised grief as well, and that not everybody recognizes it as a grief. So it can be really complicated. And one thing I tell my clients is that you still have agency. I think one thing that feels so challenging about this kind of grief, where it's ongoing and it's generational, and that we often feel very helpless, like we can't do anything. In some ways, that is true. We can't make our governments not do certain things, but we have agency over ourselves and what we can do and how we can cope with the grief.
Yes.
And how we can move along. Two things I always tell people to do is, search out community, because it can be so isolating, so very isolating. So find that community. It can sometimes be hard to find, but there are communities of people out there who are like-minded. And then take action, because that helps you feel like you have that agency and that you're not so helpless and that there are things to do. Find ways to take action, whether it be for you and your family or for the larger community.
Yeah.
For instance, in our case, in bearing witness to genocide, we can boycott, we can call our senators. There are different things we can do. We can educate ourselves. We're not quite as helpless as we feel like we are sometimes.
Yeah. Olivia, I really appreciate you drawing out. It's interesting to me as I hear it, and I'd be curious if you agree, the sort of uniqueness of that grief, of the combination of having complicated and disenfranchised grief and the experiences, and yet the commonalities. And what I mean by that is two of the most important things we can do in any kind of loss is to find community, because grief is not something that we're meant to do alone. This is just a symptom of modernity in a way, as I think about grief, is that we are taught to grieve alone. But historically, in all of humankind, this was not something that we did alone. And that helplessness is and that something happened to us robs us of our agency, again, regardless of the kind of loss that we've experienced, although certainly true in the experiences that you're talking about of racism and genocide. But all losses happen to us and rob us of that sense of agency. And as humans, like, the core things that we need that kick up our survival instinct is to belong. That's at that base of our hierarchy of needs, even before food and water, and to feel like we have agency. Otherwise, we are, the pinned down animal on the savannah. I'm thinking about sort of our ancestors, right? Like we need that ability to feel like we have some capacity and some agency in our life. So to invite your clients and imagine yourself, and I certainly did this for my clients and do it for myself in my seasons of grief, is to find community and to take action. And the action isn't solving the loss necessarily. It's about reminding yourself that you have capacity.
We have capacity, we have agency, we have power. Easy to feel like you're floating along in space aimless, but we can ground ourselves in these things. And I think what makes it especially hard in American culture is that we are such an individualistic
Yes.
culture. Community isn't necessarily built in. It is in pockets here and there, but
Yes.
by and large, as a society, we are very individualistic. When we go through these things where we're experiencing a loss and grieving, it can be that much harder to find community. So I would tell people you start to build that community now, before a loss happens or something, just because it's mentally healthy for you as well. It's mentally and emotionally healthy. But whether you're experiencing grief or not, always try to build a sense of community around yourself.
Olivia's call to build and create community was so resonant for me. It reminded me of a passage at the end of my book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, that I wanted to share with you. The first chapter of our life in the wake of loss feels so odd. Early in grief, we can't imagine ever feeling that sense of belonging to a place or to the world in any meaningful way. We often feel adrift, without a home, without our loved one. But the home we're desperately trying to find is a place in our own lives, in our own story. As we move forward in grief, as we invest in our physical, emotional, cognitive, spiritual, and relational well-being, we're taking steps back to the place of belonging to ourselves, belonging to our own story. Each time we accept support, share a memory, or create a new memory, we're laying the foundation for our story, a place we can call home. When we come back, Olivia and I explore how challenging but necessary it is to embrace the complexities of our emotions. Since you're listening to the show, you know that navigating the messy reality of grief in a world obsessed with top 10 lists and productivity can, feel lonely and confusing. That's why in my new book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss, I created a safe place to be inside the messiness of it all. I've been told that it feels like your wise best friend offering you a comprehensive and compassionate guide to navigating loss. I so appreciate those words. I share personal and professional wisdom alongside the lessons I've learned from clinicians, authors, poets, friends, and even guests on this show. In place of rigid instructions and must-do checklists, this book invites reflections, encourages self-compassion, and explores the therapeutic power of humor with, yes, a bit of profanity. One reader recently shared this. This was the best, most useful grief book I've read, and I've read many. What's so unique is that it blends the author's personal experience of loss, grief, and healing, her extensive investigation into grief resources and theories, and a remarkable, empathetic, caring, and compassionate voice. Keefauver wrote this book to help grievers, including those in acute and traumatic grief, not to contribute to the grief canon. And that purpose comes across. This book is practical, uplifting, and well-organized in a field of books that often miss the mark. Highly recommended. Thank you, reader. I appreciate it every time someone leaves a review. Now, you can pick up your copy at your favorite independent bookstore, online bookseller, or even on your next trip, as it's in more than 50 airport bookstores across the country. I've linked it in the show notes, too, for today's episode. And thanks to my friends at the Hachette Publishing Group, my UK listeners can find it on bookshelves there, too. And if you like listening instead of reading, which still counts, by the way, I narrated the book, too, so you can take me on your next walk with you by heading to Audible or wherever you get your audiobooks. Yeah, we know this. We know that the Vivek Murthy, and we know the loneliness epidemic. We know from my friend John Powell at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, like belonging is at the core of our human well-being. Mm-hmm. And our lack of belonging and our lack of community, which is another way in my mind to think of belonging, even in not times of loss, have a physiological, emotional, physical, impact, degradation
It does.
on our life. And it's so much harder to build that from a place of deficit, from a place of vulnerability. So to your point, I think whether you're listening because you're in a, even if you're not in a fresh season of your own grief, is to think about, and that can look very different. To your point, we live in in America, and particularly in the West, many of us live states away from our, family of origin, maybe even some of my best friends do not live anywhere in my near area.
Same.
So I've had to find creative ways to have community that can look like FaceTimes and onlines and I'm like old school, sending cards in the mail or traveling, right? We can find community.
We can find ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, what's sort of ironic about it is that when we don't have that community, it creates its own kind of grief.
Yes.
And that we don't feel that belonging. We don't feel like we have a backup system in a way. And so that creates its own sadness and grief. So yeah.
And it's so much easier to carry if we have, right, that we don't have to carry it alone. Like, your job is not to come fix me, as I always say in my grief. Only I can metabolize my own grief, but you can help me carry the weight of it for a while. You can accompany me or
I like that.
Keep me company as I do that. And to do that, by the way, also to turn towards our grief, I think of like the Francis Weller's way of thinking, like to apprentice our sorrow, to be an apprentice to our sorrow, actually helps us find our way to feeling part of this interconnectedness. Because, as I say all the time, 100% of us are going to experience grief multiple times in our lives. And so I've been thinking a lot lately about the language of musculature. Like, how do we build the musculature to hold and to bear the weight of grief, and to maybe even see the beauty that holding it allows us to have access to as well.
Yeah, I agree. I'm definitely, a proponent of staying away from toxic positivity. It's just as bad as toxic negativity. I think it can be just as negative. I think there's a beauty in grief. Of course, it's difficult to go through, but the sweet times are that much sweeter. It's important to experience our emotions. It's part of who we are. It's part of our story. And, I would caution people to stay away from, I shouldn't be experiencing this now. I shouldn't be feeling this way right now. I'm so fortunate because there is a guilt that's especially happening in our community right now and bearing witness to genocide, in that sort of a survivor's guilt in a way where, feel guilty about having fun or doing anything,
living in safety
or grieving or anything.
Yeah. And to allow that we can do both. And I'm always a big proponent of the both and, like that we can be present to the delight or to the joy or the gratitude of our life and bear witness to the suffering of other people. And I think as much as we are an individualistic culture, we're also a culture of either or versus both and. And I actually think that one of the magical things about being human is our capacity to be with more than one thing, to hold the complexity that is this walk that we get to take here in this world. Yeah.
Yeah, I recently saw the film Inside Out 2. This sounds like a tangent, but it's not.
No, I'm here with you.
I saw Inside Out 2, and the ending of it was so beautiful to me, in that, the girl in the film, our main character, starts out where she has all this beautiful, positive self-talk. And by the end of it, she's experiencing all this anxiety and maybe not so positive thoughts and positive feelings and things like that. And at the end, the message was, well, embrace it all. It's all beautiful. It's all who you are. And I love that ending so much, even though it's geared towards kids. It's a great message for anybody to take away.
Yeah.
All of us.
It's about living into the full expanse of our humanness. I'm giving a talk in a few weeks at Endwell, and it's about so how do we center aliveness in a world full of loss? And to be with this positive self-talk and the joy and the delight and the anxiety and the fear and the frustration is really about having the bravery and the courage to be fully alive, as opposed to what so many of us choose to do, and no judgment to any of us, because to be present to that can be extraordinarily difficult, especially if you don't have community.
Tough.
But so many of us have numbed out, right?
Yeah.
That could be social media, that could be alcohol, that could be drugs, that could be whatever it is, like we've numbed out. And so it does take, I think, bravery and courage to be present to it all. I haven't seen Inside Out 2, but I'm definitely going to. So because I want to check out how they tell this story. And we don't have to do it alone, right?
Right.
Whether that's our friendships, whether that's our community, whether that's a grief coach or a therapist or whatever that looks like.
I can be guilty of the numbing out. I'll admit
we all
it.
can.
We
Yes.
all do
Also, welcome to humanity. And I think welcome to humanity again. I think about this all the time. Welcome to that's the culture. We can't escape the culture that we live in, wherever we are, or the times that we live in. Like, you can only do what you are absorbing around you. You can push against it, right? We can make individual choices, back to the agency, to not numb it, to turn towards our grief, to build a community, to take steps to have agency. But we're never going to escape, a culture that is on 24-hour news cycle and social media and only telling the happy ending stories. Like, it's okay to, and so of course we're going to succumb to scrolling on social media or numbing out on Netflix.
Yeah, it's almost a natural response because we're so overstimulated these days. There's so much that sometimes it's almost like a protective mechanism that you do. You have those numbing out moments. So I can't blame people for doing it. We all do it, but yeah, it's trying to practice that presence when you can.
Yes, and bringing intentionality. I've been thinking a lot lately and talking with some folks about how might we pause or rest versus numb out. So like, when do we give ourselves a break from being present to all that there is, and to whether that's being in nature, or that's meditation, or that's having a playful time or something, so that we're not kind of getting to zero battery and then passing out or numbing out. Like, how can we bring intention to the rest or to the pause, which is different? It's also a practice many of us don't have, so we have to practice that too. Yeah.
No, it's true. We're trying to do so much these days. I think we are busier than ever as people. I think society just keeps going faster and faster and faster over the years.
And we're exposed to more, which is good, but also I'm not sure that our nervous system is caught up with the exposure of what we know. We only had to worry about the dangers in our cave or near back in the day, right? And then maybe it was just your neighborhood. And now and again, this is not a call to we should bury our heads in the sand. It's just a recognition that maybe we haven't evolved as humans to be able to metabolize or process all that incoming stimulus, as you said.
I don't know that we should evolve to it. I feel like we have to find different ways, as a society, but it's so much, it's a lot. And I think you brought up a good point in that in building into our day these little bits of rest or little bits of meditation or whatever it is that works for us before we get to that point of feeling like we need to numb out. An exercise that I've tried a few times is taking little 2-minute snippets throughout the day to just center or do a grounding exercise or meditation or something. That way it doesn't feel like, oh, I don't have the time. I don't have, I can't take all this time to do this. Everybody can take 2 minutes here and there. So it's a muscle that we build over time. It does take some practice, but it's definitely worth doing.
And find, as one of my colleagues says, an accountability buddy, right? Like, to find somebody who is also working on that musculature, and start a group chat to say, like, what was your 2-minute break like today? Or share your insights. Like, one of the things I think again, back to sort of the railing against individualism, is that we think we have to like reinvent the wheel and figure out how to muscle our way through the hard things. But what if we did this, in community? I want to name for all of us, whether you're experiencing, and to your point, sometimes guilt and survivor's guilt can get in the way of, like, how dare I center joy, or how dare I center delight, in a world full of loss. But if it's of any consolation, the way I've been thinking about it is actually to center delight is a nod to the people who aren't here, who don't get to have that choice. And B, when we center delight or awe or wonder or respite or rest, then we've built up the reserves so that we can have the agency, so that we can have the fortitude to turn towards either our own hard thing or the hard things happening in the world. And so it's not an either or, it is a contribution to being, I don't know, to getting back in the ring, just to mix the metaphors there.
No, I think you're right, because I look at activists and I'm like, how do they do it? How do they sustain that? How do they have the fortitude, and how do they sustain their activism? And I think it's because one thing I've learned is that in their own time, they realize they have to take time for the rest. They have to take time to fill their cup and do enjoyable things. And we can't be activists 100% of the time. We'd be depleted. We just can't.
Yes. And to you, the individual griever, if you're not finding yourself in a season where you're feeling like this is around some collective grief, but more at an individual grief, I would say the same rules apply. As much as I encourage us to be with our grief, that's one form of aliveness. The other form of our aliveness is to be willing to risk delight and to be willing to respite and joy too. And that's its own aliveness. And that gives us the capacity, or filling up the cup, to turn back towards the metabolizing of this profound loss, whatever your loss is that you face.
Agreed. It can feel like a bit of a balancing act, especially with everything going on these days. But it's necessary, we have to try to do a little bit of both: recognize our grief, honor our grief, but also let ourselves breathe that sigh of relief. Sometimes it feels like you're holding your breath.
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes. And it's okay to sigh. It's okay to breathe that sigh of relief. It's so much to carry with you all the time.
Yeah.
It's just a lot. It can be so draining. And I would say let yourself feel drained when you need to feel drained. Let yourself take the rest. I want to watch my words here in what I'm saying, and that, because there's so much going on with, especially for the people who are bearing witness to genocide, several wars going on, the racism, the politics these days, all of it, and that, do it all, we can feel drained, and we can also take time to enjoy life a little. It's okay to enjoy life a little.
Yeah. Yeah. We have to do it all. And to your point, it's a balance, and it's at different seasons of your life, at different seasons of your grief, that balance is going to look different, and that's okay too. But just to remember that there's always a time to sort of pause with some self-awareness and to see, whoa, have I been to your point, have I been holding my breath too long? Maybe it's time to suck in a little air and then kind of come back to it.
Right, right.
One of the practices I love to guide people through in my work, either in session or just on its own, is, a guided meditation around breathing in and breathing out compassion. And that reminder is that you focus on your in-breath and call your own suffering to your mind, and for a few rounds, and then you shift and call somebody else's suffering to mind, and you focus only on your exhalation. Imagine sending them compassion. But the reminder is that we cannot send compassion with an exhale until we first breathe in compassion on our inhale, and that there is no need for that either or, that there is this flow that happens. And I think about that as a metaphor for how we attend to ourselves and we attend to one another.
I like that a lot.
If you hold your breath forever, you can't, there's nothing to give, right? Or you're going to pass out. Yeah. So allowing that flow, I think, is so important.
We are black and white thinkers a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yes, we are. I think some of that, I'm not a neuroscientist or anything, but I think some of that is sort of survival, right? And a lot of that is cultural. And I think we've, in the age of, modernity and modern thinking and the scientific method, which I love and has contributed to a lot of amazing things in our world.
Yes.
I think we've moved away from the philosophical and the spiritual and the practices that allow us to hold the actual complexity of what it is to be human and what it is to be in this world. And so I think, again, balance. We want the science, we want the certitude, we want the, ways in which we can cure diseases, and we need to be able to appreciate and practice, the complexity. And Olivia, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was preparing for our conversation today is one of the things that you, I believe, do, or the sources of grief that you focus on in your work, speaking of complexity, which we've talked about already, but I think I want to draw you out on these subjects more, is how do we hold grief or be present to grief with these ambiguous losses or these ongoing losses? Again, we've touched on it a little bit here, but for so many people in this time, and I don't know if this statistic is true, but it feels to me that we have an ever increasing population who are living with chronic illness, autoimmune diseases,
Yes.
catastrophic injuries, or things that may have started with one event. It could have started with like an injury or a accident, but maybe just were these little losses of mobility, agency, capacity, uncertainty that are unfolding all the time. And I think that's a population that you work with. So I'm wondering, A, how do you put grief in that context for those people walking that walk? And what are the ways in which you show up for people in that way? What are
Right.
the tools or resources that you think about?
Well, I think we're seeing more disability and chronic illness these days, because of environmental factors, because of all the stresses that we're experiencing these days, which have been scientifically proven to trigger some of these
Yes.
things into activity for a multitude of reasons. I would say that my background is that I have a couple of chronic diseases myself. And so that's how I'm able to approach it with clients or with people who I speak with about this. There is grief associated in that you can butt your head against a wall sometimes in your limitations. Different people have different limitations. As far as having chronic diseases go, I remind myself that I am very lucky in that I don't have any organ failure going on. It has affected my skin, so that's an organ, I guess. But
Yeah. Yeah.
be more specific, I have lupus as well as hypothyroidism and two different kinds of lupus. And so I approach it in that I know what it's like and how frustrating it can be, how limiting it can feel sometimes. To this day, I've done a lot of work with myself on it, but you do feel that frustration sometimes with the limitations because I'm exhausted all the time. I'm always battling exhaustion. It can be hard to do all the things that you want to do. And with my clients, we talk about kind of what we've been talking about and honoring your grief. It's okay to recognize that there is a grief with having a chronic illness or a disability or a disease or something that you're fighting. It's okay to take the time and to have that grief. And it's also okay to pivot. Our lives don't always go the way we had planned. We're not always
Almost
going to
never. I'm
be
going to go with
almost
almost
never.
never.
There's that saying, God laughs while men make plans.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it little bit of that, but it's reminding people again that they do have agency, that they're not broken now, that they don't have to sit back. We take them back behind the barn and shoot them. It's not like that kind of thing. People still are capable individuals.
When we come back, Olivia explores more in depth what it's like to live with chronic illness, the flexibility and grace it requires, and how much it's pushed her to communicate more directly. That includes setting boundaries. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Friends, I've been dreaming of showing up for you and with you in new ways. Now, don't panic. This show isn't going anywhere. Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast will keep coming to you weekly. Over the past 5 years, I've written and distributed a traditional newsletter, the not so regular newsletter, for a large community of readers. I've done my best to make it feel intimate and personal, and the response has been beautiful. And yet, more than ever, I am passionate about creating meaningful community and offering you more insights into my work. I want a place to explore more topics in depth. I'm hoping to expand my creative expressions to include long-form essays, audio and video guided practices, a place to host some behind the scenes of the podcast, and eventually a Dear Lisa column. And more importantly, I want to build an authentic, interactive community off social media. Life is happening so fast, and I want a place where we can slow down, dive in deeper, and figure out how to metabolize it all together. And I'd love to have you join me. So I've let go of my traditional newsletter and have launched a new Substack called AFCO with Lisa Keefauver. Now, AFCO, if you haven't heard me talk about it in my book, from the stage, or even here on the podcast, it stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yes, of course, I had to get in a judicious use of cussing. And rest assured, my friends, like I do in all my work, I will show up authentically and offer thoughtful, meaningful, and practical guidance on how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. I look forward to your comments, our chats, audio and video content, and so much more. And don't worry, if you like things delivered to your inbox without having to search all over the web for it, I've got you covered. It will be delivered directly to you. Now you can head to Substack and sign up at afgoWithLisaKeefauver.substack.com, or head to my website at lisakeefauver.com to sign up, or check the link in the show notes for today's episode. Writing is one beautiful way to creatively explore your loss. But as we heard from a previous guest, Jamie Thrower, ritual and creativity can also help us metabolize our sorrow. That's why I am thrilled to share that Jamie and I are teaming up and offering a place of shelter in the overwhelm, exploring how we create a safe and sacred container for our grief. Alongside an intimate gathering of fellow grievers, we'll explore and learn about these 5 themes: the cross-cultural history and benefits of rituals in grief, key elements involved in altar building, the role of creativity in metabolizing and alchemizing our sorrow, the positive impact of creative activities on our nervous system, and finally, how mindfulness of the stories we tell ourselves and others can help us hold the weight of grief. This is a 3-hour online, interactive, and intimate workshop experience. Together, we will explore the importance of rituals and creativity in grief by listening, watching, talking, writing, drawing, creating, playing, meditating, and most of all, gathering in sacred community with one another. To sign up for this workshop or learn about future offerings, visit lisakeefauver.com/workshops and events.
Pivot and learn to work within those limitations, which again, I recognize that that can be frustrating, but also know that within those limitations, you can do a lot, and you can do a lot of good, both in your life and for other people. And so we don't always have to focus necessarily on the limitations.
Yeah. And this isn't a silver lining story, because I really hate that whole, and then you went off and created a blah, blah, nonprofit. I mean, I did do that, but or whatever, then something beautiful happened. And I can imagine, and my best friend has been struggling with advanced Lyme disease for years and has a lot of limitations, and that you might gain some perspective and appreciation for the days you do have energy, or for the things that you can do in ways that if you weren't, and again, not that you wouldn't choose to wave your magic wand and get rid of lupus if you could, because you would.
Right.
And I do think, just like any kind of loss, it's an invitation for you to shift how you see and to appreciate relationships, people, experiences, abilities in different ways than unfortunately you might not be called to appreciate if this hard thing didn't happen to you.
Yeah.
I want to come back to something you said there about the pivot, because I think it's so important, and I wouldn't be me if I didn't also help bring us all back into the conversation, is that I think culturally, to your toxic positivity point, we're much too insistent as a culture. I'm not saying you are not, because I know I'm gathering that you are not, to move people like day 2 to the pivot. Like, okay, enough,
Right.
feeling bad for yourself. We've got to pivot. But part of what it means, I imagine, I've just navigated cancer for the last 2 years, but I do not have a chronic or autoimmune disease, so I can't speak to that. To the notion that as the disease course or the illness course flares and doesn't flare and comes and goes, it's not like you're going to be in your grief and then you're going to pivot to the seeing the capacities. Is that it's an amorphous, ongoing,
It's
every
ongoing.
day. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes maybe
ongoing.
multiple times in one day. Might that
Yes.
be? Yeah.
From minute to minute sometimes, going back to the toxic positivity thing, I try to stay away from that with my clients, as well as from saying things like, things happen for a reason.
Oh my God, please don't ever. Yeah.
Because I'm not saying it's bad to think that, but it can also there can also be a lot of guilt and shame around thinking that something happens for a reason, because then you start to wonder, well, am I being punished? And it gets into a whole myriad things that won't help you in the end.
Yeah.
So I try to stay away from silver lining.
Yeah.
Things happen for a reason and stuff like that. But yeah, it can happen from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, in that it's not, and it's the same with any grief process. You don't go through this and then that and then that and then that.
It's messy
orderly.
and nonlinear, and
it's messy. Our brains are messy. Our emotions are messy, and it's all okay. It's okay to experience all of it at the same time. It's going to hit us sometimes all at the same time. Like we're running a gauntlet of emotions, and that's okay. From day to day, I am frustrated by my fatigue, but I also am thankful, like you were saying, for those times of energy where, okay, now I can do stuff and I can do that. And it actually has helped me manage my time better.
Probably get better at setting boundaries and saying yes and no to things.
Setting boundaries, exactly. Saying yes and no to things and setting boundaries and communicating to friends. My close friends know that I have health issues. And so if I need to cancel, they understand that I have things going on. And that I'm not just being flaky or something. And so you get to allow yourself more grace when you can work through these things and understand, I'm a person with limitations, but I can still do a lot. And it's okay if I'm not always doing a lot. It's okay to rest.
Yeah, which applies to all of us, by the way, whether you're listening with a autoimmune or chronic illness or not. I invite for all of us to find, as I said before, more pause, more rest, more respite and reset, because that's the only resource that we can draw on that then allows us to be present or to have the energy or the strength to navigate whatever it is that we need to navigate
for sure.
in our life. I can imagine that in this instance as well, finding community among other people who might experience the same limitations that you're experiencing, or the same frustrations, or the same mobility issues or energy issues, is important. What have you found as far as community and this particular form of loss?
Yeah, I think it's very important. There are different communities that exist out there for people with chronic illness. Over here in Los Angeles, we have Lupus LA, who has these support groups that I've attended from time to time. Ironically, a lot of the time I'm too tired to attend. But, when I can find a little energy, I go, because I don't know that many other people who have lupus. And so, it's good to connect with other people who are going through what you're going through, who understand. And I know that there are other communities, like for MS and people who have experienced cancer and things like that. There are support groups out there. Maybe your doctor or a local hospital can help you find some of these support groups. Different organizations can help you find support groups. And then there are different communities, even outside of having an illness or anything like that, where you can find different support for people who may be going through any number of things. They're just there to have like local community.
Yeah. As you were talking and thinking about community, one of the things that came to mind, because I think this has come up with some of my own clients and even with some past guests, is when we think about grief and loss, of course, and when it comes to autoimmune disease or chronic illness, of course, we think about the person experiencing it. But one of the things I want to name is that if you're the partner or the parent or the friend or the caregiver of that person too, you can be experiencing your own losses because they aren't maybe able to meet you where you're at, or it is caused you to not be able to have the plans that you wanted to have or the life you wanted to live. And so I just want to extend the circle of concern and the invitation to people sort of at that caregiver or that extended level too, because there's grief in that too, right? In being the partner or the parent or the child or the friend. Yeah.
That's such a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because it does affect more than just you.
Yeah.
Sometimes. And so, yeah, I know, I believe there's Al-Anon to support the community of alcoholics out there. There are meetings for, there's Alcoholics Anonymous. There are different communities also for caregivers and things like that. So I'm really glad
just
you
to
brought that
validate.
up. Yeah.
And just to validate for all of us. And I want to remind us about this sort of idea around the concentric circles of grief support, which apply to all kinds of grief loss, which is like, I want to invite all of us to remember that if our job is to offer support in and receive support out. So we, the caregivers, are not going to be necessarily going to the ill person themselves to get support for our own grief because they're sort of at the primary center of the concentric circles. So we offer support in, that's our role as caregivers. And then we receive support kind of one ring out. That might be our own friends outside of that circle or a community or a support group, as you said. That's not to invalidate the need. It's just to remember that we want to not doubly burden the griever sort of experiencing it and then having to be a supporter also to the people outside, which I know, I don't know about you, but for me in my own grief, I've definitely experienced that where sort of people further out were kind of leaning on me. And I was like, I don't have it to give. You got to go. You got to go in the other direction to get that support. And that's, of course, how would we know that? Again, we live in a pretty grief a little culture, but just
that's such a good point though that you brought up, because I think sometimes when somebody's diagnosed with something or when they've lost an immediate family member, not everybody has the language and not everybody knows how to deal with that person's grief. And so I would tell people, please go learn how to support this person, whether it's through therapy or read some articles online or go to a support group, or people are going through things. So learn how to be a support. Sometimes all it takes is saying, how can I be there for you?
Yeah. Or just, I say, show up, shut up, and listen. That's sort of my grief support motto. And again, just to come back around for all of us who are alongside of somebody who's experiencing profound grief, because we will all be both grievers and grief supporters sometimes at the exact same time over the course of our lives. The reminder is, yes, to show up, as you said, and how can I support or be really specific? I always love it when people can offer, like, I can offer this or this, like be specific in your support. Equally and important for you to also then go seek your own support, because you cannot, back to where we started earlier, which was you cannot pour from an empty cup. So be there for other people, learn the language and learn the behaviors and the rituals to be there for other people, and refill your cup by attending to your own grief.
Yes.
I think the reason so many of us struggle to offer really valuable grief support is because we haven't learned how to attend to our own losses. So it's not selfish. In fact, I think it's a very generous act when you learn to attend to your own, because it makes you more capable, not less, of showing up for other people.
Yeah, years ago in 2001, when my father died, it brought my family closer together for a few years, but at the same time, we didn't really know how to be there for one another because we were all experiencing the grief.
Yeah.
So that can be difficult, and sometimes you do have to go outside of your immediate support system and find that support. At the time, I went to therapy, and that was very helpful. And I would say my therapist at the time, I'll get kind of transparent here about it. But he told me, there were a lot of unsaid things when my father died. So I had a really hard time grieving for a long time. For 2 good years, that concentrated, there's a lot of concentrated grief there. And then, of course, past that. But he kept saying, write a letter to your father and go read it to him at the cemetery. And I resisted it so much. I was so resistant to it.
You're
I
like,
was
this
like,
is too woo woo. I'm not gonna. Yeah,
yeah. I was like, it's too woo woo. It's too.
yeah,
It seems really silly. Like, I'm not gonna
yeah.
go read a letter to a headstone. I mean, literally months. I think for a year or two, I resisted it. But the grief and the anger was
Yeah.
just eating me up inside.
Yeah.
It really was.
Grief has to move. It
It
has
has
to
to move.
move. Yeah.
Yeah, it really does. And I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with myself. I just knew like it was killing me. So I was like, fine, I'll give this woo woo thing a try. So I sat and wrote a letter, and I shocked myself. It ended up being 13 pages long because I didn't realize how much there was inside me that was
Say.
left unsaid, and all the things that I had to say to him. And I went and read it to him at the cemetery, which felt really weird to me. But the point of it all is that sometimes you have to get out of your comfort zone and do the woo woo things and do the things that you might not necessarily feel comfortable with. But it was amazing what that did for me. I mean, it lifted, like, I felt like I had an anvil on my chest, and it kind of lifted that. I was able to talk to him and say some things, and I think it was really productive for me. And
Beautiful.
I'd recommend it to anybody. If you don't want to do that, just, you don't have to, but just saying, like, get out of your comfort zone sometimes and looking for
Yeah.
that help.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that really personal story. And I think it just illustrated so many things that I think is important about how we learn to attend to our grief. One is the sort of, it's all going to feel awkward and uncomfortable because it's all new to you. Like, we've
Yeah.
never been here before. We've never done this particular loss, navigated this particular loss. But I do think so much of what we hold on to are the unsaid things, the unfulfilled wishes, the unacknowledged apologies or harms. It can be multi-directional. And that helps and that keeps us in a stuck kind of place. And that's where
Does.
we can end up in rumination and all of those things that kind of keep us in a perpetual past state as opposed to being able to move forward with our grief. And so even if you want to just take step A instead of step B, and you maybe don't go to maybe you don't have a graveside or a headstone, maybe you've cremated or they're not available to you. But I do think letter writing, and it sounds like maybe you've used this with your clients too. I do think letter writing to your loved one, all the things, say the things, allow it to be, because it's the writing. And then I do think the performing, even if it's not at a headstone, saying it out loud in your own room or whatever.
Yeah.
There's something visceral about the movement that can happen. Is it going to make your grief go away? No, but actually it's just going to unstick it. Is that the right way to think about it? It's going to allow it to move and allow you to make new meaning about your relationship, about where you're headed in your life. Yeah. Have you ever thought, or have you used that even with writing a letter to Lupus, writing a letter to your illness? What might that practice look like?
I haven't. I like that idea. I haven't written a letter to my lupus, but I kind of like that.
Yeah.
I thought about it only in terms of writing a letter to a person, but you bring about a good point. I might try that.
Yeah.
Because there are things I want to say to my lupus.
Yeah.
It sounds like such a silly thing,
No, but it's so powerful.
effective. Yeah, it
It's
really
so
is.
powerful because one of the things we know about our emotional life, again, particularly when we feel isolated, which many of us do in our grief, is that we end up swirling the same conversations and the same thoughts in our heads, and they have a emotional and physiological impact on us, but we don't even really know what it is because it's all kind of in an echo chamber in our own head. And so to write it out and then to speak it out means we get to discharge or move things or hear beliefs that we've been holding that maybe are getting in our way and we didn't even know we were holding them.
Yeah.
But also back to sort of maybe as we begin to close the conversation, the anger that, we talked about earlier on when we think about witnessing these profound, horrific losses, at a collective level, but even the anger that those of us who've navigated an illness or watched a loved one navigate an illness feel towards our illness has to be moved. It has to be witnessed and seen. So whether you say it out loud to your therapist, I think, which can be really helpful, or in a grief support group, or write it and speak it directly to the person, or in this case, I think the disease that has caused the limitations, is a way of making space in the sort of interiority of you to figure out what's then next, because it just all needs to be seen. It needs to be witnessed.
Yes.
Yeah.
It honestly felt like I was in this sort of purgatory and I couldn't move. I couldn't move past. And it's not that it made all the grief go away and then I was
Yeah.
happy go lucky
Happily ever
after that.
after.
Yeah, but it like you were saying, it felt like it moved through me and a lot was said and a lot was able to get out. And before I wrote that letter, I didn't realize how deep seated some of these things were. I didn't realize I had so much to say and so much to address because he had a heart attack, so his death was sudden.
Yes.
So it's, it was so, so helpful. So yeah, and I think that's what complicates it these days with the people who are bearing witness to war and genocide and various things where the grief, where it's an ongoing thing, is that, they don't always have that moment of catharsis all the time, but there's still things that you can do. And letter writing can be one of them in that moving through the grief and letting it move through you.
Yeah. I think those ritual practices, which by the way, letter writing doesn't have to be a one and done, as an example of a ritual, it could be how you light a candle or say a prayer, or if you're religious or whatever those things are, it's about keeping it all moving, I think. And so especially if you're experiencing an ongoing loss, to find ways to be in ritual or to be in ways in which you can discharge or express what's coming up for you, even if it looks different each time, the ritual itself, and whether or not the sort of words or the feelings or the emotions shift over time. There's no right way. It's just about the kind of keeping the flow going, I think, if that makes sense. Yeah. And to feeling seen. So you may read it out loud to nobody in the, in the graveyard or, sort of in the cemetery, and to find a person like somebody like you who does this work with individuals, to find a community, to myself, friends, somebody also to be witnessed. We need to be witnessed. Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think we fully appreciate sometimes the power of saying things out loud. And I get that a lot with my clients, in that they don't normally have someone to sit and listen to them for 60 minutes at a time, to let them just get things out and to talk, and how cathartic that can be for them, even just one session. So I'm a big proponent of go to therapy or go to coaching, both, and try to find that person in your life to listen to you. It can even be a relative or a friend, but find the help that you need to get and have someone bear witness. It's like what we're doing these days. We're bearing witness to so many atrocities, but someone can bear witness to your grief. Ask your friends to listen. For instance, when the genocide first started, I needed to talk about it a lot with my friends. I definitely had a lot to say and needed to be heard. And I just needed it to be acknowledged in some way that this horrible thing is happening. Please care.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was a lot of that. And I think, I just see it so much with my clients, and that society's so busy and we mean well, but we oftentimes don't have time to really sit with friends and family and listen to these things. So it's so
We have to
helpful
make
for
time,
them. We have
because
to make the time.
we have to make time because other grief finds a way. And when grief isn't witnessed, it's meant to be metabolized. It's meant to be attended to or accompanied. It comes out in sideways rage and anger and violence and isolation and loneliness. So I've so loved having you on the show today and beginning this conversation with you to remind us to let's be in community with one another. Let's attend and bear witness to one another. Let's make precious the sacred work of being with our grief, even as we are with our joy and our delight, and to be in community and to be sharing all of that together. Olivia, thank you so much for joining me in conversation today on Grief as a Sneaky Bitch.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved this conversation, and I'm so glad we did get to talk about how important community is and searching out help, and really appreciated it. So thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you. Well, my friends, as promised, this was a fascinating and far-reaching conversation. You can learn more about Olivia Abousaid by visiting pact-coaching.com or follow her on socials at pact_coaching. Now, one of the themes I want to reinforce with you before we go is the importance of building and sustaining community. I know what you're thinking. Going places and seeing people in grief, particularly in early grief, can be exhausting. In fact, that was a chapter title in my book. And I want to remind you of some things, my friend, that we're not meant to navigate grief alone. Even though most of us live in a culture that puts individualism on an altar, it just isn't a reality. We humans are social beings, which means our well-being requires a sense that we belong. Whether it's reaching out to an old friend, making a new friend, joining a grief support group, or something like exploring a creative outlet in a group setting, please find a way to feel accompanied on your grief journey. I hope this show is one outlet that helps you feel like you belong, because you do. Now, don't forget to look for video clips of our conversation on social media at Lisa Keefauver MSW, or watch the unedited version on my YouTube channel at Lisa Keefauver MSW. Friends, if you loved our conversation, learned something from it, it would mean the world to us if you do just a few simple things. First and foremost, share the episode with another griever who might just need it too. 2, make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listened or watched so that you don't miss the next episode when it drops. And while you're there, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review. You can do it on Apple Podcast if you listened, or on YouTube if you watched. I want you to know that I read each and every one of your reviews, and they truly mean the world to me. I want to thank Giles Smith, as always, for the sound for the music for today's episode. Okay, my grieving friends, remember that, yes, grief is a sneaky bitch, but don't worry, I got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.